I want to introduce our two presenters today. Jason Boley is a Senior Vice President here at BWF. He is the head of our systems and operations teams, really focusing on all those systems, operations, and business process requirements for our institutions. Jason has a unique blend of fundraising expertise and information technology skills that he's developed over 2 decades of working with private colleges, public research institutions, and healthcare foundations. He's a recognized leader, and some might call Titan, in the industry in all aspects of development operations, and is active in ACRA, CASE, and several other professional service organizations. Joining Jason today is Meryl Milano, who's an Associate Vice President at BWF, specializing also in fundraising operations and systems. Meryl has an incredible background with a variety of client helping streamline systems and processes with a focus on contributing to the overall success of the fundraising operations. Meryl has also successfully developed strategies for improving systems integrations and tailoring business processes that ensure productive outcomes. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jason and Meryl for the content of today's session.
Hi, thanks, Katrina. Just want to mention before we move on some of our additional upcoming webinars, which you see on the screen there. And this PowerPoint will be available later, and hopefully you've gotten an email with the full schedule of those webinars as we continue to try to put out useful content to support folks during this exceptional time, which we'll talk about during the webinar, which is positioning the information strategy teams during mandatory remote work, which is where we are at the moment. I'm going to go over the agenda real quick. We're going to talk a little bit about today's context, so I'll start off with that. Meryl's going to talk a little bit about getting to the new normal, and then we'll spend the bulk of the time talking about mapping out priorities for an uncertain future, which is the bulk of the presentation, and then generating some ideas and discussion at the end of the webinar. And again, if you have any questions as we go along, please type those into the chat box, and Katrina will be compiling those as we go along. So I just want to start out, everybody's kind of been bombarded with information over the last week or so. And what we don't want to do here is kind of beat a dead horse, but I do feel like to start off, we need to acknowledge kind of where we're at. So first, if you were unable to join our first webinar on Monday, Josh Burkholz, our CEO, shared some really insightful information about the last potential economic downturn, which was in 2009, and if we're facing what could be a similar situation in the current environment, there are some things that have kind of been consistent, and I found these very insightful to look at. Now, these don't apply directly to information services, but I did want to share them in this webinar. And there are a couple directly applicable to what we're talking about, and I did want to highlight those. So during the last economic downturn, some definite things that we saw were donors shifting to urgent recipient level needs. We've already seen that in the news, so we know that that's already happening. We're focusing on the now and urgent needs. Some major donors felt embarrassed talking about their financial situations, which is totally understandable. We're all aware of the volatile stock market at the moment. We have situations where volunteers are being pulled away from current campus activities to focus on other things such as their business and that economic repercussions. From a gift processing perspective, long-term commitments did stall during the last economic downturn, but the pledge volume recovered. So while we'll see probably a short-term issue with collecting on pledges and the dollars associated to them, that did begin to recover shortly after that period of time. And then the last one I think is particularly relevant to where we're at on this presentation, which is that many stories of donors, in those stories, the donor staying connected to the nonprofit, they cited acceptance, patience, and confidence as reasons for returning to the nonprofits after the period of economic uncertainty. So what we're really focusing on right now, and what the focus of our project should be focused on right now, is the donor experience, retaining those donors, staying connected, pumping out hopeful messages so that people feel that connection to us, and that's what's going to carry us into the next phase. So if we look at the phases from a project management perspective to set the context for what we're talking about today, I think it is important to acknowledge where we're at. When you do a presentation like this, I think there's a natural tendency to kind of almost draw a little contradiction with risk management. I just want to be clear that we're not really talking about risk management here, because the risk is already here. We're now in active incident management. So the phases of that, and there's several iterations of this that you can see, but I kind of like this flow. But when we talk about project management in an active incident, there are certain phases that we'll go through. And of course, we start out with the incident. So we're not talking about managing risk here. The risk is already here. The incidents will already happen. We know what we're being faced with. We move into assessing the incident to figure out how we're going to react. And then we have to actively manage what we're doing in the midst of the incident before we move on to the resolution and recovery phases, which will come. It's hard to remember that when you're in the midst of an active incident, but those phases will come down the road. Right now, I would say we're probably somewhere between the assessment and the management phases. Last week was a lot of reaction to people starting to work at home, reacting to remote work and donor needs, and we're moving slowly but surely into that management phase. So that's what we're kind of talking about today. Then we will move into probably an active period of what will be the temporary new normal, which is the management phase, before going back to normal. And normal will come again, and that's important to remember. So just some things to remember in the current status. Again, we're not in risk management, we're in situational management. That is important to think about when you are assessing your current project priorities, and when you're trying to communicate to leadership as well. They need to understand what the situation is and what we're trying to work on. We can't always react to things like we've normally done. We're in a period of extended remote only work, potentially limited human resources. We don't have all the people that we normally have access to. We could be experiencing very real constrained budgets. That's already starting to come out in stories in the Chronicle and things of that nature. We need to be sensitive to those, not only from our institution, but from our donors as well. And that's going to impact existing project priorities. We've got, but disruption, such as we're experiencing now, creates opportunity. And so we're going to have also a period of creative thinking. I've already seen it. Hopefully you've seen it. And hopefully you're drawing some comfort and strength from that as well. And again, organizations that continued engagement and long-term planning are the ones that emerge stronger from the last economic downturn. So we've got to keep focused. We're going to reorganize our priorities, but we're going to keep focused, and that's going to make us poised and ready for when things start to pick up again. Meryl?
Sure. So as we look at this current phase in the situational management process that Jason was just referencing before, we got to think about how both we get our information strategy teams as well as our fundraising partners set up to move forward effectively in an extended period of remote work. So not to belabor anything that you've heard already or experienced and learned in real time over the past couple of weeks, but want to emphasize a few unique needs that you and your organization are probably grappling with right now. So from a fundamental standpoint, we really need to make sure that our remote teams can still securely access the tools that they need to do in order to continue to engage donors, process gifts, steward those gifts, and report on results and activities so that our leaders can continue to make those important decisions in this evolving situation day to day. To highlight a few things here, obviously we've got some internet connectivity that we've got to deal with, second monitors, headsets. These are sort of the how do we do our work in this new remote environment. But specifically when we think about accessing a CRM, a donor database, any of those associated tools, like an online engagement system or maybe a reporting platform that you and your teams use to push information out to leadership and to stakeholders, it's really going to be key to making sure that the appropriate revisions to security are made so that those employees and those managing those systems can access these tools. For some of you, that might mean establishing a VPN or other remote access method. And for others, that might be about adjusting security on those current systems and tools in order to facilitate that access and that ongoing process for interacting with them. All of this is going to be especially important for your information strategy teams because they typically have a more advanced toolkit than some of our frontline partners in terms of the tools they need to create customizations, to build reports, build dashboards, so on and so forth. So as we have all heard and experienced, keeping teams engaged is a whole different ballgame when we're scattered geographically, and it adds a whole nother level of nuance on top of just getting them connected. So our BWF team in particular, we've been remote for several years. So we've wanted to share some of the tools that we use in our toolkit to keep collaboration going, to keep engaged with each other and the projects that we're working on. Fundamentally, the exact tools that you choose are not necessarily important. It's the mechanisms that you're encouraging for connection. So informal communication channel like Slack, like Skype, like Google Chat, whatever you might have available to you. Project management tools definitely going to be important as we go forward, and it's something that we'll highlight further on in the presentation in terms of what are some of those options and opportunities there. And then definitely want to think about secure document sharing, especially for those that are passing PII, other sensitive and confidential information between teams across employee groups. This is going to be important to consider in terms of what tool you will use to share prospect portfolios, to share solicitation lists, to share reports that might contain some of that sensitive information. So once we're connected, once we've reached that new normal, as we're all calling it, we've really got to start wrapping our head around the day-to-day and how we pivot any of our new information strategy priorities that really meet the changing needs of our institutions and our constituencies. So the first step is really going to be gaining the perspective on those changing priorities and understanding how those might have shifted as an institution. So what we've tried to depict here is really some of the different sources of impact that will likely result in a priority shift for your institution. So a university, for example, is likely to be grappling with some loss of revenue. What do we do with tuition and board in terms of students that may no longer be on campus? And so we've seen that really realized in terms of a shifted priority in recent days in a refocus on some student relief funds that we're seeing more and more of. So we know that priorities are shifting. We know that we're going to need to realign our work as information strategy teams in order to realize those new priorities. So how do we go about tackling that? How do we remain the driving force in making sure that our leaders have the data, the analysis, the business intelligence they need to make these shifts as an organization?
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what the changing priorities are, but what we want to do now is move into a few slides where we talk about specific ways in which projects should be reevaluated in the current environment. So there is a process that we can follow here, and I would argue that this process is applicable to both micro and macro projects at this point. What I mean by that is this could be, depending on your situation, this could be smaller projects, a lot of smaller projects, but also scales up to your bigger projects, such as if you're going through a CRM implementation. If it's a bigger project, you might have even sub-components of that project, of course, that require different evaluations. But for me, it's important to follow a methodology, and that's what we have on the screen here. And this is what we try to follow and talk about with our clients when we talk about managing a project portfolio. If you're a manager or a leader in an organization, what you're really doing, just like fundraisers have portfolio of prospects that they're managing. When you're an IT person and or leader or manager, you're managing typically a portfolio or a collection of projects. So we need to know how to organize those. So the first step is going to be, we have to know where we're at. We're going to assess those projects. So we need to take stock of where we're at, and we need to collect certain pieces of metadata on those projects. There's a certain base set, which we'll talk about in a minute. But that's really setting out where we are. It's also important to record those, which sounds like a really simple step, but a lot of places fail to like just logistically record that information in a manageable format. And then in the middle, we're triaging our portfolio of projects, and that's what's going to shift in our current environment. So this is triage, the process of taking quick intake, evaluation, and setting our priorities for the current next phases, which that moves us into the second to the last phase, which is prioritization. So we triage, we intake, then we prioritize, and then once we've determined what those priorities are, we can move into the execution phase. All of those kind of flow together to help us again take that portfolio and restructure it and to react to the current environment.
So the first step in our process, as Jason described, is really getting our arms around what's on our to-do list. What projects do we have existing already in the queue? What are the new projects coming at us as a result of some of the recent changes that we're experiencing? And so we'll identify those new projects, we'll classify them in terms of, are they new, are they changed, are they existing? And then we start collecting that metadata that Jason referenced a minute ago. So we've highlighted some metadata points in particular here, and these are the points that we'll use to evaluate our projects and to shift our projects in future steps. So it's really important to start collecting these now, what we know of them from the requester, from our team members who are working on them. For example, what's the status of a current project? Is it close to completion? Is it still 80 hours away from completion? Is there a resource assigned that is maybe not available to work on that anymore, or needs to deal with some shifting hours? Who's the requester, and what's the deliverable for? What's that summary? Because we're going to need to understand if that audience or if that deliverable need has shifted based on the changes that our organizations are making in real time. For example, is it a list pull for an event that's now canceled? So once we have collected all of those details, we need to do something.
Yeah, and I just wanted to highlight a couple things in that list that are important at the moment. Is if you're managing a lot of projects, you may have a lot of this already collected, but updating the status is going to be critical, because if we're in the beginning phase or end phase, or where we're at in the project, can also influence what we're going to choose to put on the back burner, so to speak, or delay or carry forward with. And that last point there, vendor dependencies, is also important because you not only have to worry about your situation that you can control, but your vendors may also be having some resource issues. So if you're working with project partners, it's important to take into consideration their schedules and resource impacts at the moment as well.
Definitely, especially with that remote work component in terms of how the vendors might be interacting with your systems or needing to access your systems, depending on the type of project that is. So once we've collected all of that data, we've got to do something with these details to make it workable, to make it something that we can use to reference, to update on an ongoing basis. So really focusing on these essentials. What you're seeing on the screen here is a sample of an existing project portfolio that I've been using with one of my clients in particular over the course of the past several months. And it's really just to show you a visual of what something like this might look like. You may already have something similar that you're already managing, which is great. Some of you may need to move forward with establishing one of these on your own as part of this process. So you've got an opportunity to either look at the existing tool you have or look at that new tool that you're going to be developing and make sure that whatever you're using, it can be quickly and easily accessed. It really is going to convey the volume of what you are looking at and the status of those projects. And that this is something, whether directly through the tool or through a report on top of the tool, that you can share with leadership, that you can share with stakeholders and project owners to communicate the status, to communicate dependencies and change in either of those items. So this resource in particular, we built in Smartsheet, but as long as it's collaborative, as long as it's a tool that you can use to convey and maintain collaboratively, that's what you're really going for. It's not about the tool, but how you're using it. As Jason referenced a minute ago, we've got to now, once we have all of this data, start doing something with it. So we have to evaluate and really triage the lists of both current and new projects. The risk that we're all facing right now is how do we get it all done? And the true fact that we need to start acknowledging is not all of our projects are possible at this time, but that's okay. We have an opportunity to really focus on what is needed from an organizational level, what is needed to serve and engage our donors and serve our constituencies. So when we think about shifting the priorities and really triaging our current projects, we're going to want to look at, do these need to be continued and proceed as they are? Do they need to be postponed for any particular reason, or do they need to be canceled? So thinking back to that example that Jason provided a minute ago of a project that is 90% complete. If we can get that across the finish line and still serve that requester and that deliverable, that's likely going to serve us in the long run versus something that we might need to cancel if it's no longer needed from a requester standpoint. When we think about new projects, we're going to have to align those against the priorities we established in some of our preliminary steps, but we're also going to need to develop a mechanism to make sure that we have sort of eyesight to those new projects as they're coming in. We know that everything is evolving on a day-to-day basis for our organizations and for our teams. So making sure we've got that single point of intake for new projects and to manage those new projects means that as an information strategy leader, you're going to have the ability to understand workload and to rebalance and shift based on some of that triaging that you're going to be doing in real time.
Okay, so when we talk about this project reprioritization, we're going to have to make the case for this. And generally, it's not enough to kind of have an opinion on why certain projects are more important than others. We want to try to look at objectively why. We want to try to measure that objectively. And so you can look at the categories that are on the screen here in terms of a scorecard methodology, a weighted scorecard methodology. These are all kind of categories by which you may measure the importance of a certain project. So when I work with clients, this is generally kind of some of the buckets that I will look at when I assess a project. Look at its general impact. What does it mean internally? What does it mean externally? And what is the potential? What does the project address in terms of risk? So what has happened though on the screen, and I won't read through all of these, but as I was reading through this the last couple of days, I was trying to think about how our potential impact priorities have shifted so that some things have become more important than others. So the items that are on red on the screen, I would argue, are the things that have changed or become more important, evident over the last few days, couple weeks, in terms of what we might want to consider when we look at projects. Now, when we talk about risk, anything that, of course, threatens work stoppage or imminent security risk is always going to be number one. But right now, and I'm kind of working from the right-hand side to the left, but right now, as we talked about at the beginning, customer and donor satisfaction is key. So any process that can kind of enhance that donor relationship and remain connected to our donors is going to is going to be vital, whether that be an improved receipting process so we stay in touch with folks, or there's been a lot of chatter about DocuSign lately in order to kind of improve efficiencies with getting donors to sign documents. Those kind of processes are critical at the moment in this remote environment. Resource availability, technical feasibility, financial resources, and vendor resources, again, are all things that are bubbling to the tops in terms of what and these are categories too that, again, are important to convey to our upper management, our executive team, in terms of why some things are being pushed and why some things are boiling to the top, and why some things need to have some money spent on them right now. I wanted to share this visual as a methodology for thinking about projects in terms of how you might categorize them. There's different versions of this you may have seen on the internet. This is one that I've adopted and kind of customized for our needs, but basically it's looking at the up axis measuring impact and the horizontal axis measuring urgency. So up here and these are ranked in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 order. So our top one would be highly urgent and highly impactful projects, boil to the top. Again, system downtime would fall in that, all the way down to projects that fall onto more of a watch list because we may not have budget for them. They're just they're low urgency and low impact, or we may not have the resources to even do it. So it kind of falls to a watch list. This is something, of course, you can adapt. Some matrices have like 6 quadrants. This one has 12, and but the point is to have some kind of methodology by which you can kind of begin to organize these projects and level of importance. And you can even have a physical version of this in which you kind of like post-it notes with projects if that works for you, so that you can kind of keep yourself organized internally.
So all of this is about how do we rank our projects, both old and new at this point, in an efficient and a transparent way. And so that can be visually, that can be via words, that can be via that project portfolio. But a lot of this is really going at how are we going to leverage our executive sponsorship? How are we going to prioritize the donor experience? And how are we going to coordinate and communicate all of this, all of these details, the urgency, the impact, the balance of the workload, the status, and so forth, to those individuals, to those partner teams that you're working with. Your ability to say no is really going to hinge on your ability to communicate the other projects in line before a particular project, and is going to hinge on your ability to provide that insight on status and provide that insight on urgency and impact and so forth. In terms of executing, really looking back at that slide that Jason spoke of, that full cycle, it's not linear, it's really cyclical. We're going to be changing priorities day to day. We're going to have to be evaluating our workload and our team's bandwidth day to day. And so we really want to make sure that we have a process of executing our projects that takes that into account. And so one of the things we'd really encourage you to look at is adopting a meeting methodology. For those of you on the webinar that are information technologists, the idea of a scrum or a daily stand-up is probably very familiar to you in terms of that methodology. For those of you that don't have that background, it can still be adopted as a way to review workloads, track status, track progress, and really sort of replan and troubleshoot as you go on a daily basis. And so it's not limited to technical projects. It can really be used throughout the full project portfolio that you're managing. Another option in terms of managing these projects is those project management tools that we've been talking about throughout. So on the next slide, we've got a list of some of the tools that we've used in past lives and that we've used with our clients. They really range from simple to all the bells and whistles you could ever imagine, and from minimal to no charge to more expensive and sophisticated. So some of your institutions might already have some of these tools or multiple of these tools available. So I'd encourage you to explore what some of your partners are using if you don't yet have a project management tool in your toolkit.
Okay, so just want to close this section with a few tips, and then Meryl and I know we're running a little bit over on time, so we're going to be brief. Talk about some of the projects our clients are currently focusing on, and then part with some questions or discussion. So in terms of tips during this period of time, again, work cannot stop. And it's going to be important if you're a manager to stay in touch with your team frequently. Again, that Scrum methodology. It's hard to keep on top of your teams when you're remote. And so it's going to take an extra effort to do so if you're just entering that realm. So being intentional about that and creating that time to do that every day is going to be critical so that you know what resources are being devoted to which projects. And also communicating that upward. An intake methodology is going to be critical during this period. You're going to have a lot of new people asking for a lot of new things. A lot of places can't afford like sophisticated intake mechanisms like help desks and such, but trying to create a singular point of intake and someone that can organize that intake is going to be critical to your success during this period, especially when you're remote, so that things don't fall through the cracks, and finding a way to log those centrally. One of the key takeaways I'd like you to have is to take notes during this period of time, during this incident that we're in. It's going to end, but the pains that you're experiencing now are going to be the things that you need to work on when things settle down. And when you talk about creating risk management plans, when you talk about improvements, if you're taking notes now, because normal will return, and when that returns, you will tend to forget things, just like I do. Take notes now, a little diary, whatever it takes to not let those things fall off the radar, because that's really your planning for the future. So that's really important. And then again, coordinating how to say no. That can be a difficult thing with executive leadership, but now everyone understands what we're going through, and this is the time to push back on some projects which just you do not have the resources to devote at this time, and that's going to be really critical. Just covering real quickly the last couple of slides of idea generation for those of you that need it. Many of you don't have a shortage of things to do at this time, but we did want to put some ideas up here because for teams that are experiencing some downtimes, our clients are still working on things. It's a good time if you are in a downtime to think about strategic projects. Could be skill development, learning new skills, assessing your team skills, thinking about a strategy to go to self-service reporting, which is really quickly right now. Now's not the time necessarily to implement a technology, but planning for that can still happen. CRM projects are not going to stop. Technology implementations are not going to stop. You can be poised for that when we come out of this period. Good time to think about data governance. Grateful patient data management. We'll talk about that again on the very last slide. Very important at the moment. And then short and long-term strategic planning.
We also outlined some of the tactical projects that we're working with clients on at this point, and we know that a lot of this is probably already going on at your organizations, but it's one of those, we've got to revise some of our day-to-day depending on this new remote work environment. So listing some examples here, how do we pivot maybe an in-person training into a remote office hour or an online sort of ask me anything type of method. We've been getting and seeing a lot of chatter around that electronic signatures and forms, and how do we manage gift acceptance and gift agreements when we're all working remotely and maybe can't get live signatures at this point in time. And then if all else fails, I feel pretty confident that there's a list of policies and processes that you've been meaning to document and get around to doing that. And so what are some of those high priority items that have been on your to-do list for a while that you can take a moment and focus on tactically?
And just speaking from personal experience, recurring donations is going to be a theme probably to come out of this period of time. the charitable donations that I've been able to maintain with consistency personally are those that I had set up on recurring payments. Those organizations there's not been any disruption there. So if you haven't emphasized that at your organization, now's a good time to note that and bolster that program, because we're seeing the impact of that right now. Just in closing, a few closing thoughts. Again, the current situation is going to end, but the lessons learned during this time should impact your future priorities, and that should happen, and that's appropriate. I think the pandemic has a real potential to revolutionize charitable giving in ways that we don't fully understand yet. There's a short-term impact with attention on immediate need projects as we talked about, but I think and I'm really looking forward to hearing about or seeing some of those things that come out. These are times that prompt creative thinking, and it's important to remember that, and important work is still happening. And just a note on healthcare organizations. Everyone, after this settles down, is going to be a grateful patient. Everyone's going to be touched by this virus, and it's going to present a unique challenge to healthcare organizations. So think about your grateful patient program. If you don't have a efficient grateful patient pipeline at the moment, now's a good time to be addressing that issue, because there's going to be a whole new kind of set of environs around that data going forward. It's an interesting impact of the current environment, and an interesting challenge for healthcare organizations going forward.
Well, thank you so much, Jason and Meryl, for your time today. Being that it was the ownership here at the firm who organized around the many questions that you as our clients and our broader client community have been sending along to us, the teams responded to try to get the content out that you all had emphasized was important and were in special need. And so I thank both Jason and Meryl for their time in getting us organized today with this content. We ask you for the next few minutes to continue to post any questions, and as I mentioned, we'll get those follow-ups to you. And again, all the information will be sent along via an email as well as posted to bwf.com. So all the information will be readily available to you following today's session. And I'm going to synthesize a couple questions here just so we can maximize our time. But we have all levels of both leadership and staff on the webinar today. And so some of the questions pertain to what can I do best to support my teams from a leadership perspective, thinking about those individuals in chief development officer positions or as vice presidents of organizations that are at the top who are in those daily leadership meetings, getting those daily updates and are going to be the ones determining those priorities, as well as those individuals at all levels of leadership and staff who are going to be at the tail end receiving that information to determine how to leverage their teams and to do the work. So I'm going to synthesize that by asking, how can I best support my teams in my leadership position? And then the second part of that being, as I am the teams actually executing these projects, how do I make sure that I can effectively say no and that information be received appropriately? Jason, Meryl?
I can start on that a little bit, and then if you want to add. So it's a difficult topic. And I would just boil that down to basically, how do I manage up in a nutshell? And so the way I kind of condense those thoughts are, in the absence of information, a narrative will be provided for you. So you can either help shape the narrative, or you can react to the narrative that's created for you. So what I mean by that is, if your leadership or management does not understand what you're working on, if they do not have a clear picture of what your priorities are and what you're working on, the narrative is going to be forced upon you to react to. So the organizations that do this best and the managers that manage this best are creating and providing a clear picture to management about what the team is working on, how many resources are consumed, and what the priorities are and why they are that way. It doesn't have to be a fancy, difficult thing. We sometimes think of management tools, and they can be nice, colorful charts and graphic dashboards, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? The important thing is that there is a clear line of communication to the top about what the team's priorities are and what they're working on and what's taking the time, what's taking up their time. Because if that's not understood, then there's going to be kind of, there can be kind of a, oh, well, you know, what's Joe's team's working on? We don't really know. So, you know, let's use them for this, you know, and they need to be working on this. But if you can insert and kind of shape that narrative, then you can mitigate some of that risk.
And I would add to that for those who are in leadership positions, the building the opportunity to trickle down that prioritization and really make it clear who is prioritizing these items, why these priorities are shifting, so that if someone gets pushed back on a no, so to speak, that there's backup and that there's support in terms of why that priority might have changed or why a new project might have jumped to the front of the line.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much to our presenters, Jason and Meryl, and thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. We know everyone is busy, and so we're going to keep the webinar open for a few more minutes. Please continue to post questions, and we've got a variety of other webinars that are going to be taking place over the coming weeks. Tomorrow's is really focusing on maintaining your mission in this new remote environment, which will be facilitated actually by myself and my colleague Jeff Hilpertz. And we've got several others for next week, and we will soon be posting out our schedule for the following 2 weeks as well. So thank you again all for joining us today. We wish everyone a great Wednesday, and we look forward to seeing you virtually soon.